I'm Aaron Ross Powell, and this is Reactionary Minds, a project of the UnPopulist. We're used to thinking about politics as a battle between left and right, progressive and conservative. But those sides can be somewhat protean, their positions, preferences, and policies shifting in ways that make it difficult to analyze the political landscape clearly. My guest today has a different way of framing politics, one she first set out 24 years ago, but which looks more and more prescient with every passing day. Virginia Postrel is the author of many books, including The Future and Its Enemies. Her latest is The Fabric of Civilization. The core of Postrel's framework for understanding politics isn't left versus right, but dynamism versus stasis. What does it mean to be a stasist, to use your term?
What I say in The Future and Its Enemies, when I'm just laying out the basic distinctions, is that dynamists, which is people like me, have a central value of learning. We can talk about that later, but the contrast is important. And stasis come in a couple of varieties, but their central value is stability or control. And then I divide them into what I call reactionaries, which are the people who are more into keeping things literally the same, not necessarily the status quo. It could be going back to some imagined past or creating some utopia, but the idea of a stable society. And then technocrats, who are much more common in liberal democratic societies, who say, well, we want progress, we want things to change, but it's got to look exactly like this. And that's and very much an early 20th century idea of control and planning the future so that progress becomes something not that evolves, but that is dictated.
When you say early 20th century and the rise of the technocratic position, is that because something new happened in the 20th century? Or is it because prior to the 20th century, stasis kind of won out because we weren't moving very quickly anyway?
Well, that's a very good question, and not one that I really thought about when I was writing this book many years ago. But I think what happened was that the rise of large business enterprises, railroads, and huge manufacturing corporations, vertically integrated enterprises, where you had to have a range of control to operate the business. And so that all happened really beginning in the 19th century, where you had these much larger organizations that had existed before, and they were very successful, and people developed new and genuinely innovative and efficient ways of doing things. And that led to an idea that, well, if you can do this at US Steel or General Motors, you should be able to do it for the whole society. And that, in fact, because they were run by the profit motive, these enterprises maybe were a little inefficient and wasteful and duplicative. Competition was seen as wasteful and duplicative. And so that you could do something about that if you could plan the society in general. And so that gives you, there are many forms of this in the early 20th century. Obviously, you have the full-blown state socialism control, state ownership of the means of production, extreme versions in places like the Soviet Union. But there were also much more sort of I don't know, democracy-friendly versions associated. I mean, Thorstein Veblen, who's famous for the theory of the leisure class, also wrote a book whose title escapes me at the moment, where he contrasted the good engineers with the bad financiers. And the idea was that, if you could just set engineering principles loose on society, you could have a much more efficient and productive society. So that idea was in the air, and it came out of real business innovation that just got applied in ways that didn't work. And one of the things that's interesting about sort of the history of liberalism is that before Friedrich Hayek's writing on the use of knowledge in society and the whole socialist calculation debate, and I don't want to get into the weeds of that, but what was wrong with that theory of control wasn't obvious. And so a lot of people who were basically liberal became very attracted to socialism because it seemed like a way of improving the lot of people and sort of extending the liberal contract in certain ways. And the idea that it was replacing local knowledge and even the knowledge of individual preferences with some kind of necessarily dictatorial, even if it was being done in a democratic way, process was not obvious in 1900. It was not well articulated. I think there were people who sort of understood it intuitively, but it had not really been fully grasped.
Well, that raises an interesting distinction, I think, within stasism as opposed to dynamism. Is you have what you've just described is an awfully, let's call it, ideological or philosophical argument for stasis. The technocrat, you had these arguments about the way a firm runs, and we can analogize that out, and we can manage progress and so on, and that's like an intellectual approach. But a lot of stasis seems to be more of a like almost an aesthetic approach. I'm thinking of like and so you get people like the Wendell Berry or Josh Hawley in some of his earlier pre-political career writings is almost making an argument that the ideal America is one that always and forever looks like a Thomas Kincaid painting. And, and it's, or the like, modern architecture is bad and what we really need is like the return of the aesthetics of the Catholic Church to rule us or something like. Are these distinct things or do they bleed together?
Well, okay, so they are distinct things, I think, and historically they're distinct things because they're very different reactions to what's called the Second Industrial Revolution. That is the rise of these really large enterprises, railroads being the quintessential one. In the 19th century, you also have the arts and crafts movement around William Morris. You have the rise of neo-Gothic architecture, which is initially a very ideologically freighted thing. It is a rejection of industrialism. I mean, the irony is that it then becomes just, I write about this in The Substance of Style. It becomes a style. And so therefore you get to a point where you have Blair Hall at Princeton University built and named for a railroad magnate in the neo-Gothic style because it associates the university with the great universities of Britain. So it takes on a different meaning over time. But there is definitely, in reaction to industrialism, not only this kind of technocratic argument, which also takes a Marxist form, but there is a sort of medievalist argument as well, that we're losing handcraft, we're losing beauty. The cities are ugly. They're crowded. Of course, cities were always crowded, but coal smoke and factories, and it is a kind of ugly transition in many ways, and that therefore we should go back to a kind of pastoral, hierarchical, often Catholic uh, ideal. And that is a kind of reactionary stasis, which is very prominent in a lot of the great literature of the period. Not so much in novels, but in poetry. And so, yes, they are two distinct, very old. I mean, at this point, we're talking 150 years old. I guess that's not old by human history, but certainly old by American history. Ideals, and they take different forms. The American ideal is different from the European ideal, the sort of reactionary ideal, and also one thing that's different is, while there is this kind of Wendell Berry, farmer, slightly medievalist view, there is also in the U.S. a kind of wilderness ideal. So in Europe, the cultivated landscape is always, or almost always, the ideal, whereas in the U.S. you also have a notion that untouched by human hands is ideal, and that's less common on the right than on I don't know, I hesitate to call it exactly the left, but in the environmental movement.
Well, that raises my next question, which is, does this technocratic versus reactionary or traditionalist or natural, does it by and large map onto a left-right spectrum? Like, it certainly seems like technocrats are the left and the center left, generally speaking, and the people calling for a return to the old ways tend to be on the right.
Well, yeah, part of the point of The Future and Its Enemies is that these things do not really map onto the left and the right. They cross those divisions, and it is so that it's just that what people want is somewhat different. And so, conservative technocrats might be more inclined to regulate land use so that you have single-family suburban homes, or regulate immigration in a technocratic way so that you give priority to people who have a lot of college degrees and professional skills, because they're going to be, a Brahmin from India is better than a peasant from Guatemala, because we can anticipate that. So, I mean, I'm just using those as examples. I think also I describe technocracy as an ideological ideal in the early 20th century, because there was an intellectual movement there. But I don't think it is primarily ideological. I think for many people it is common sense. It is common sense that somebody ought to be in charge, and people ought to make rules, and we ought to control things. And if this is dangerous, we should prohibit it. And if it's good, we should subsidize it. I mean, this is the norm in our politics. And that wasn't new in the 20th century. I mean, things were subsidized and prohibited forever. But it got this patina of efficiency and rationality and modernity in the early 20th century. It took on an ideological air, but it is the norm in our politics. And that's one reason I spend a lot of time in the book talking about it. But really what interests me is I think of it as the norm, that is it's what most of our political discussions are. But both reactionaries and dynamists therefore have to make alliances with technocrats in order to sort of get the world they want. So they're kind of the polar opposites. But the question is, who, in some ways, the technocrats kind of decide who wins.
How, I guess, totalizing are these two, are the dynamic versus the static viewpoint? Because there are lots of vectors for change. There's technological change, there's social, there's political. And so I'm thinking, like we right now refer to, say, the Trumpist movement as conservative, but populism is, on the one hand, very stasis in culture shifting too quickly. I don't like it, make it stop. But it's very politically radical in terms of the systems that we have in place need to be torn down and replaced.
Yeah, so I don't think there's. I describe them as if they're these silos, but that's just a model. That's not reality. that's the map, not the landscape. First of all, most people have elements of all of these things in their thinking, in their intuitions, in their politics. As you say, it's not just. It takes multiple dimensions. So somebody may think that we should. I mean, even within, say, economic regulation, somebody may think that we should let people build houses more freely, but the FDA should regulate really tightly, something like that. It's, and what you talking about the radical institutional aspects of populists of various types brings up the issue of rules, which is one of the things that's the trickiest to understand and to grapple with, which is, how do you think about rules? Let's say you want this kind of dynamism, you want this kind of learning, bottom-up, order without design, trial and error, correction, economic progress, social progress, or social learning. What sort of rules give you that? And there's very much this idea of, you need sort of nested rules, and you need certain rules that are fundamental and don't change very often. And that's just sort of, you could call that the constitutional order. And those need to be fairly simple, and they need to be broadly applicable, and they need to allow things like recombinations and people using their own knowledge to make decisions and plans. And there's a chapter about that, which I then, in a completely different context, reinvented in the Substance of Style. Honest to God, I did it from the bottom up. I didn't refer, because it was all about sort of neighborhoods where people, the fact that people care about what houses look like, but on the other hand, they care about their neighbor's house, but they will pay money to live in a planned community. But on the other hand, people want freedom. And how do you think about that? And so one of the issues is, you need to be able to move from, when rules are very prescriptive, there need to be ways to exit. So what you're seeing in this populist kind of upsurge is a notion that the rules that we think of as not changing very much, not that the sort of stable institutions, the liberal institutions that govern societies, are barriers to what populists want. And so therefore they need to be taken down. And so that does become a radical kind of move. And one of the misperceptions that was in lots of reviews of the book was the idea dynamism equals change, and I'm saying all change is good. Well, first of all, even in the process of dynamism, that is bottom-up change, not all change is good. It's an experimental process. Sometimes you do things, whether it's you start a company or you change you change your living arrangements, and it's a bad idea. It doesn't work, and that's why we need criticism and competition, and that's part of the process.
How do you handle then if the goal is we want a dynamic society because it produces all of these, I mean, the book is full of all the wonderful benefits that come out of a dynamic society. But at the same time, the people who are fans of stasis, yes, a lot of them take it like way too far in a reactionary direction, but there is something fundamentally true to the notion of wanting things to be somewhat stable and familiar. I just 3 weeks ago moved my whole family from Washington, D.C. to Colorado. And we all know like moving is incredibly stressful, and not just because of like all the logistics you have to deal with, but like uprooting yourself is deeply stressful and takes a long time to get reestablished. And a dynamic society, lots of us, more people move in a dynamic society than they have in the past, but the world around us is changing too in a way that feels like the same stress that I have with moving. And so people want like my life is settled and is going to look roughly tomorrow the way it did today. Like there is something very like human and understandable about that. And so how do you get the effects of dynamism without everyone constantly feeling like they're being uprooted?
Right, right. This is a really good question, a really hard question. Part of it goes back to this idea of nested rules and also nested commitments. One of the important aspects of dynamist rules is that they allow for commitments, that you can say, you can make contracts of various kinds, to use the term, but it could also be marriage. It could be, I'm going to live in this town and I'm going to be involved in civic institutions and volunteer institutions, and I'm going to put down roots here. That said, one of the difficult things is that one person's stability is another person's sort of is an intrusion on another person's plans often. So for example, I write a lot about housing, and there's some about housing in the book, but there's not as much as I would probably put if I were writing it today. And one thing that we see in Los Angeles, where I live, is there are a lot of veto players whenever you want to build anything. And they are people who want their neighborhood to stay the same. One result of that is that people who have grown up in Los Angeles, the children of people who lived here, cannot live here anymore because it's too expensive. And so that's this kind of, I want stability. Oh, but wait a minute. I'd also like to see my grandchildren. Oh, but now they live in Texas because they couldn't afford to live here. So there's often trade-offs with issues of sort of trying to make stability, but human life inherently changes. Generations come and go. We grow older. People have children, et cetera. So there is a certain amount of change that always is going to happen. But there is a highly non-ideological issue, which comes up, in fact, in my most recent book, The Fabric of Civilization, in the context of the original Luddites. So the Luddites the original Luddites were not ideologues. They were not stasists who wanted to keep medieval ways because they liked the Middle Age, what the Middle Ages represented to their intellect. They were weavers, hand weavers, who had prospered from the invention of mechanical spinning, which gave them ample supplies of thread. So they had prospered because of the technological and economic upheavals of a generation earlier. And now they were losing their jobs to power looms. And so they were mad. They were stressed. And and at that time, losing your job was not like losing your job in 21st century America. Losing your job meant your children might starve. I mean, so there was a reason to be upset. And they engaged in both nonviolent civic activity, petitioning Parliament and that sort of thing, and also violent riots and smashing looms and that sort of thing. And the government said, no, you don't get to choose. And there was a technocratic aspect of that, avant la lettre, which is they said, look, this is going to be good for society. It's going to create new jobs and new industries. It's going to make Britain more prosperous, right? Against its rivals, all of these kinds of things. And so power looms went ahead, and some of the Luddites got deported to Australia, the more violent ones. That is really important in the history of economic prosperity. And the people who were the children and grandchildren and great grandchildren of those people are far better off in basically every respect than their ancestors. But it was a true, genuine, painful transition. And I don't know what my prescription would have been other than back then, other than let this go forward. In a richer society, there are things that can be done with redistribution to ease those transitions. Another thing that I think we don't emphasize nearly enough in the U.S. today is the traditional American thing of moving to different parts of the country. There's considerable evidence that has become that people are more locked into place than they used to be, and that makes certain things more difficult, particularly if you are somebody who is living in Detroit, say. It might be better if you could move to Colorado or North Carolina, but you don't have the money, because moving is not just disruptive, it's expensive to do so. And there may be other barriers like licensing regulations or that sort of thing. But the main barrier is, aside from the psychological barrier, is the financial one. So I think that's the sort of thing you need to think about from a policy point of view. But you're right. People like change. They like the benefits of change, but only up to a point.
There's another side to it too, I think. As I was rereading the book in prep for our conversation, I kept thinking there's a moral imperative of dynamism when you think about it in a social context, because the story you just told is an economic and a production one, and the disruption that can come from changes in economics. And we see this all the time. Like, a lot of the reactionary movement right now is about we're losing the old lifestyle of working in the factory in the small town and supporting your family at a middle class level on one salary. That's gone away. That's an economic story. But I think a lot of what we're seeing today from illiberal sides is about social change, and it's about, so the anti-trans backlash is in a lot of respects about like my conceptions of gender and gender roles there are people who are setting those aside, living in ways that are contrary to them, but we also see the traditional family is under attack, right? And it's not under attack in the sense of someone is coming and trying to like just tear apart my traditional family, but that there are people who are living in non-traditional
Right,
ways,
right.
and it makes me uncomfortable. And in that case, you know, it seems harder to justify the stasis worldview from a moral standpoint, because what you're saying is often people who were traditionally marginalized or oppressed are now able to get outside of, are now centered in a way that they didn't used to be, are gaining privilege in a way that they didn't used to be, have status in a way that they didn't used to have, or are able to express themselves and author their own identities in ways that they were. And I don't like that. That makes me uncomfortable. We need to shut it down. We need to punish corporations that are too woke in like what they're expressing or what they're putting in movies and television. And that one seems harder to say, yeah, you've got a point, because telling other people they can't have dynamic self-identities isn't the kind of thing that we should necessarily correct for or compromise with.
Yes and no. I mean, if you, the way you put it, sure. But it's also the case that a lot of these fights are between two sides, each of which wants to force the other one to adopt its worldview, and to pay obeisance to its worldview. So that it's not just that I have to tolerate someone who has, whether they believe that everyone who doesn't believe in Jesus will go to hell, or whether they believe that someone with male genitalia can be considered a woman. I mean, those are two worldviews that you can live in a society where people hold those views, and we just kind of tolerate them. And it's like, I don't care if you believe Mercury is in retrograde, makes your computer go crazy. I think it's stupid, but okay, sure, what the hell? We can treat them like that, or we can have fights where everybody has to get on the same page. And a lot of what we're negotiating now is, what is it where everybody has to be on the same page? And this is the great fights that led to liberalism in the first place, were the religious wars, where there was an assumption that unless everybody agreed, that unless everybody in a society was of the same faith, the society would not be strong. And so they kept fighting over, obviously this is potted history, but they kept fighting over that until they were exhausted and said, let's have liberalism instead. I mean, that's oversimplifying much. So the question, a lot of these fights today are about, how do you accommodate when people have radically different worldviews, live in the same society, have to know about each other's worldviews. I mean, one of the differences today versus when I was growing up in the, in the Bible Belt, is that everybody sees everything. It used to be, I mean, the people I went to college with at Princeton, for the most part, I mean, I could have been. I was a liberal. I was raised a liberal Presbyterian, but the assumptions I made about the people around me, and uh, were, I might as well have been from Mars. I could understand Renaissance literature in a way because it's steeped in a religious society in a way that most of the people that I went to school with couldn't, because they had never been in a place where everybody was religious. And really religious, not just nominally. And also that affects like jokes and stuff. Like supposedly my freshman roommate got mad. She told somebody because I had said she was going to hell. And considering I didn't believe in hell, that was impossible. But I must have made some kind of joke that anybody who knew me in high school would have understood. Anyway, this is a long way of saying that I think that you're right. And this goes to the issue of commitments and being able to carve out your own life, that some of these fights are about that. Although we've seen one of the things that happened since I wrote The Future and Its Enemies is when I wrote The Future and Its Enemies, I was for gay marriage, but that was way ahead of the curve. And it became a kind of it advanced partly because of this desire to have a kind of commitment and conservatism while accepting different sexualities, so I see this as a constant negotiation, and going and I also see the economic ideals as not being completely disconnected from it. So when people talk about the good old days, let's go back to the good old days when you could work in a factory and have a union job and raise a family on one income and all of that. Well, first of all, I'm from South Carolina, and that wasn't the case then. I mean, even if you were white, that people were poor. Okay. And they could, yes, you could do that. You could raise a family on one income if you were like an engineer, but not if you worked in a textile mill. You would have both parents working in the textile mill and probably the teenage kids as well. And that's, again, if you were white. If you were Black, you were even worse off. So that there is a kind of centering, as you say, of a particular, not only ethnically narrow experience, but also even regionally narrow experience in that kind of nostalgia. And I think that remembering who's left out is an important part that goes to this issue of knowledge, of the knowledge problem, of the idea that dynamism allows people to operate on their local knowledge, and it allows people who might not be included in the big top-down view to force themselves to be included because they just go through life and do their thing.
Yeah, and I think part of that is that it's not necessarily stasis, or not necessarily always stasis versus dynamism or change, but it's about pace of change. And this is where the point that you made about we're all aware of what each other's doing in a way that we didn't used to be makes this, because there always are subcultures that a subculture adopts a handful of things and then innovates on them very quickly and becomes like weird and pops up. And so like, they have suddenly everyone's goth for a little while, and goth is like very different. And then the pace of change in this shows up in fashion pretty frequently, or me trying to keep up with my middle schoolers slang or so on. But that pace of change, with the social media stuff in particular, we end up in these situations where you don't even think that you are necessarily like that your subculture is a subculture anymore. You think it is the dominant culture because you've cultivated your Twitter following, and everyone you know online knows to talk this way, or that these terms are passé or shouldn't be used anymore or whatever. And then you assume that's what everyone knows and everyone talks about. And so I don't even know that in a lot of cases it is you saying, I want to force my subculture's views
Right.
on everyone else. It's more just you assume that that's what all of the views
Yeah, it's
are, and
like
that
my
everyone else
joke
is weird
about you're
holdouts.
going to hell. I mean, which it's like, I assume that you know how I mean it. Oh, wait a minute, you don't, because you don't come from that subculture. And it used to be that these subcultures were, I mean, the mainstream media, the New York Times, Time Magazine, etc., did not know, and even Gallup polling did not know there was such a thing as born again Christians until Jimmy Carter. Like, I mean, and they were a huge percentage of the population. It's just that they weren't the people who worked at the New York Times. They weren't the people who lived in New York for the most part. And so partly because I have this weird background of having lived in a lot of different parts of the country, and I'm more aware of how many subcultures there are. And my Facebook group, people, my Facebook friends come from all of them pretty much. But I think you're absolutely right that part of what happens is people assume that their norms are universal or should be universal, and that therefore people who violate them are bad people. And there are rewards for making those assumptions. There are rewards in terms of attention. There are rewards in terms of, you go girl, or whatever. And that has been corrosive. I think that it's not new in human history, but as you say, there has been a sort of an acceleration of it, and the idea that you could know about these horrible other people who think differently from you is more likely. And you don't just know about them, you probably get a distorted picture of them because it's being filtered through people who are spinning it or selectively representing it in a way that maximizes not only its strangeness, but its evil.
Yeah, and I think we also too don't necessarily appreciate the pace at which things change and that what becomes accepted in our subcultures. You mentioned, like, you wrote this book. This book was published in 1998, I think it
Yeah,
was.
right. So I was writing
And
it in like 1996,
yeah,
97.
and I mean, I was in high school in the 90s, and thinking about, so gay marriage, you mentioned gay marriage, like how dramatic the change on like accepting of gay relationships and gay marriage has happened. That when I was in high school, is what was it, Ellen coming out on her sitcom, it's like, we're going to have a gay character on television, was this huge, like, this was national news.
Yeah,
Everyone was
right.
talking about it. Whereas now, 30 years later, it's just like, so what? There's a gay character. Like, it happens very quickly. And I wonder, well, this makes me think, like, how much of this is about, and going back to the rules too, ambiguity versus clarity. Like, that people want to know how things are and how they're going to be. And and that a lot of like rapid change is about, it's not constant. It's not uniform. It is experimentation and competing views and figuring out which is the right one or which is the acceptable one. But all of that messiness means that things are ambiguous, and that what we want is clarity. We want to know, okay, this is the rule that I'm going to have to follow tomorrow. This is what's going to be acceptable. I'm not going to get called out for this. I'm willing to change, but I want to know what it's going to be. Um, and that dynamism is inherently ambiguous.
Well, I think that is part of it. I think people do want to know people do want to be able to make their own plans and structure their own lives, and in a way that it is going to work for them. I would argue that you're better off in a world where people aren't constantly making new rules from their plans to run your plans. I mean, that's one of the big dynamist ideas. But the other thing, when you were talking about people want clarity, it made me think about how people. So one of the things that I've written about over the years is clothing sizes and problems of fit. And bear with me, this is relevant. Okay. So people tend to think that it would be better if there were specific clothing sizes, that if you knew that a size 8 dress, every size 8 dress was for a 35-inch bust and a 28-inch waist and I'm making these up, and a 40-inch hips or something like that, that would be great. Because everything would be the same. You would know exactly what you were getting. It would actually be terrible. And there's a reason that sizes in the 40s, the clothing manufacturers, the catalog companies actually went to the government and said, could you please establish some standard sizes? And they did. But almost as soon as they were established, different brands started not complying with them because it wasn't required. It wasn't a regulation. It was just you can establish these standards. And the reason is that people's bodies come in different proportions. Even two people who are the same height and weight one will have longer legs, one will have shorter arms, one will have a bigger waist, the other will have bigger hips, etc. And so what happens is brands develop sort of their own fit models and their own sizes. The lack of clarity actually makes it more possible for people to find what fits. And I think that is an analogy to one aspect of dynamism. That is the fact that there isn't a single model that everyone must comply with, makes it more likely that people can structure their own lives in meaningful ways. Now, that said, this goes back to this issue of nested rules and there is no doubt that hammering down on people because they express views that were perfectly normal 10 minutes ago, or worse yet, they use a term in a non-pejorative way, they think, and suddenly it's turned out that it's now pejorative. This is not good. This is a kind of enforcement of treating as fundamental rules things that should be sort of flexible and adjustable and tolerant. And there is this idea of tolerance when we talk about tolerance as a liberal value, a liberal virtue. But there's also, think about mechanical tolerances. I think a society needs that kind of tolerance as well. That allows for a certain amount of differentiation and pliability, that allows things to work and allows people not to be constantly punished. Zero tolerance is a bad idea. Anytime people are having a zero tolerance, you're almost always going to be running into trouble.
So you published this book 24 years ago. And I think, as I said at the beginning, I think the framework and the thesis that you articulated in it is really powerful and helpful for understanding things. But the political landscape and the cultural landscape looks rather different now than it did in the 90s. So looking at the threats to dynamism that we see today, the rise of a liberalism, I guess, what are the lessons that we should draw from the stasist versus dynamist framework for countering those threats today, or at least understanding them in a way that may prove helpful to ameliorating them.
Yeah, well, there are different forms of illiberalism around the world, and there are different reasons that people back them. One of the things that is striking in the rise of Trump in the US is that one component of the people who voted for him, I don't know whether this would be true if he runs again, because the whole January 6th thing alters this somewhat. But many of the people who voted for him were kind of frustrated dynamists. That is, they were people who are really sick of technocracy. They're really sick of being told what they can and cannot do. They're really sick of the fact that it's hard to build things, that it's hard to create, especially with atoms rather than bits. And I mean, Peter Thiel might be an example of a high profile example, but there are lots of like just little guys who own plumbing companies or whatever who are in that category. And the notion that you need to knock over the table to effect change, I think some of that comes from this idea that that technocracy has tied down ordinary people like Gulliver and the Lilliputians. So I think one thing that needs to happen, again, I don't know that this applies in Hungary, but it's certainly, I think it's applicable in the US, is that technocrats need to get their act together, at least some of them, and need to get a little more dynamism in their heads. And you're seeing some of this among intellectuals like Ezra Klein and Matt Iglesias, sort of on the center left. They need to, and you definitely see it in the issues around housing. So that's one thing, because dynamists can't do it alone. And we need allies, and we need to peel off technocrats who will support, many of whom are liberals or think of themselves as liberals in the sense that they're not illiberal. And so that's one thing. As far as the people who really, want to go back to the Middle Ages, I mean, part of this is you need to tell different stories, and this is hard. Culture is hard. I mean, this is not a libertarian show, but one of the things that I say to libertarians and also to conservatives, that they always act like they talk about culture the way leftists talk about markets, as if there's one giant lever, and if I could just get my hands on that lever and pull, I could make everything the way I want it. And that's a fallacy in markets, and it's a fallacy in culture as well. It's a dynamic, whether you like it or not, it's a dynamic process. And so I think part of, I hadn't really thought about this, but in a way, The Fabric of Civilization, my latest book, which is the story of world history through the story of textiles, one thing it does is it says the world is always changing. Even in the periods where it changes slowly, it changes. And there are always people who are pushing against the established order, whether it's economic or cultural or whatever. And another thing that it says quite explicitly in the discussion of traditional clothing, and if somebody goes to my Substack, you can see I posted this as a something, is that people don't generally want to make a choice between tradition/identity and modernity/progress. They want both. And given control over their lives, they will find ways to incorporate both, to hold on to what they value in terms of their identity and tradition, and to get the benefits of modernity and liberalism. And I think many people who really like change don't fully appreciate that. It was definitely not appreciated at the beginning of the 20th century and the sort of technocratic move that we talked about earlier. But if you look, for example, the example I use is the way indigenous women in Guatemala dress. Now, they can buy jeans and T-shirts just like everybody else, but they choose to dress in traditional garments, except they're not really traditional. I mean, they've changed in a lot of different ways. The blouse, the daily blouse is made in a factory. It's made out of polyester. It's not woven on a hand loom, but it still looks Maya, because that identity is important. And I think there is a universalizing element of liberalism that wants everyone to be a rootless cosmopolitan. And even those of us who basically are rootless cosmopolitans aren't really. I mean, we actually do have roots. I mean, I am very dedicated to living in Los Angeles. I really am from the South. Whether I like it or not, it shaped me in certain ways. I have certain ties. And liberalism needs to understand that that's how people are, that they care about where they come from. They care about things that are passed down in their families. They care about their community ties. And that is perfectly compatible with liberalism and dynamism. But the manifestations of that will change. And this is why the great social success story of the past 25 years is, from a sort of a liberal social point of view, is the story of gay marriage, because it says, yes, gay people are different in certain ways, but they are embedded in families. They want to be embedded in families, not every single one, but in the sense that most people want to be embedded in families. The mere fact that you have a sexual orientation toward the same sex does not mean that you want to leave that all behind. It means you want to have Thanksgiving, and you want to get married, and you want to have kids, and all of that is part of normal human life, or since time immemorial, can take a slightly different turn and still be compatible with these very ancient conservative institutions, which, by the way, have taken a zillion different forms over human history.
Thank you for listening to Reactionary Minds, a project of the UnPopulist. If you want to learn more about the rise of a liberalism and the need to defend a free society, check out theunpopulist.substack.com.